Good evening. A vociferous 20th century architect once told us, architecture should be an ice axe to cut the sea frozen inside us. Architecture should be an ice axe to cut the sea frozen inside us. The Patrik Schumacher retort, ice axe architecture is ephemeral. It can never be the premise for contemporary practice. Could they both be correct? Do you recall those first century architects unsure of the durability of their message, excavating surreptitiously beneath the streets of Rome, one step ahead of the centurions? Deep underground, they left us the confirmation of their perseverance, carved in the walls, floors, and ceilings of the Roman catacombs. Wait a minute, we're getting there. Centuries later, the inheritors of those catacomb architects, attired in royal purple, strut their iconography from vaulted ceilings in Ravenna and domed roofs in Rome. A historic travelogue from a precarious underground existence to pontiffs of the dome roofs, a metaphor for the archetypal architecture journey some call progress. From saboteurs of the contemporary culture to progenitors of contemporary public taste, from architecture the exception to architecture the rule. Is architecture forever better, or is something gained and something lost in the journey from catacomb to vault? A Russian sage reminded us there is no history, only histories. But he omitted the contradictory corollary, my history is your history lesson. My history is your history lesson. Is my history your history lesson? Maybe not. Patrik Schumacher has generously contributed his autobiographical text, The Autopoiesis of Architecture, to the International Architecture Discourse. An autopoiesis of architecture, presumably everyone's architecture. History is singular, not history as a plural. We write history, and history becomes the history we write, is the Patrik lesson. Once upon a time, and a very good time it was, Zaha Hadid and Patrik Schumacher launched an upstart architecture adventure from beneath the streets of London. For years, the two of them sent their ubiquitous notes up from underground, explosive drawing, shape and space interrogatories, and the promise of a new form language for architecture, rumbling up from below. Before theory, before method, before coding, there was an autopoiesis of intuition. Remember this, the architect must love her instinct more than anyone else ever will. She did, and she does. Zaha and Patrik insisted, not everything or nothing, rather only everything. And it worked. Tentative at first, fragile at first, notes from beneath the streets of London at first, then innocence to experience, lost to found, accident to method. Congratulations to Zaha and Patrik, colleagues in imagining that the world could be other than it is. Here's how they did it. Invent the concept, discover the tools. Imagining precipitates the technical solution. Technique ratifies the original inquiry. Zaha and Patrik did both. But wait a minute. The story's not over. How does it conclude? The readers of autopoiesis are not its writers, and architecture is not a steady state. At their back, riders at the dome tops always hear time's underground rumblings hurrying near. Every good architect must know the ice age inevitably returns. Zaha and Patrik also know that when the robots fail and the plasma cutters collapse, architecture will again necessitate the primitive's ice axe to cut the sea frozen inside us. In anticipation of the arrival of architecture's next ice age, we are pleased to present Zaha Hadid Architects with the SCI-Arc ice axe. Please welcome Patrik Schumacher to SCI-Arc.
Wow. Okay, well, thanks a lot, Eric. First of all, for the invitation to lecture and to produce an installation, which is, by the way, on the road from San Francisco. And I can promise you the design is great. And we'll see what arrives later tonight. I'm not sure what you mean by the kind of coming ice age, but perhaps there is a moment of retreat, I feel, in some institutions, in some countries even, Japan, Korea. They're supposedly going back to basics, some of the things we're doing there. I'm not sure if that's what you meant. Not at all? Okay. But I do believe in progress, and I do believe that the 21st century is kind of moving forward in the direction we've been preparing at the end of the 20th century and the last 10, 15 years. That's the way forward for another foreseeable future, as far as I'm concerned. And I will talk about that. Last time I was here, it was already 2 years ago, exactly. And this was just before Volume 1 was coming out. It came out, I think, that month. And in the meantime, Volume 2 came out earlier this year, and I've been starting to lecture on Volume 2. The core content of Volume 2, the first segment, is in fact this notion of semiology and the refoundation of architectural semiology as parametric semiology under the auspices of parametricism. And I will go into this. It means, and that is to some extent picking up on what Eric was saying, it's true that our initial lust for complexity, our initial lust for dynamism and curvilinearity was a purely intuitive drive. My selection on being drawn to Zaha in the 80s was an intuitive, instinctual be drawn to, and it is true that we're moving from accident to methods, from action to reflection and theorizing, and that starts after we've kind of in the thicket of working, and then becomes a kind of guiding principle. And I do believe that architecture is a theory-led discipline, and always its founding moment in the Renaissance was the moment where it separated out from business of construction, became a kind of design discipline based on the drawing, which allowed for theoretical drawn-up projects, and immediately was kind of tied in together with the formulation of treatises, printing books, circulating books with drawings and arguments, and that's what architecture is. But at the same time, it is a kind of trial and error and experimentation process, and each career has, I think, this oscillation between thrusting forward on the basis of intuitions and then moments of questioning these intuitions perhaps reflecting, reconfirming them or redirecting them, and then again through theoretical discourse, and then again relying on them in the day-to-day action. So, but before I'm going to elaborate on parametric semiology, I want to do two things. First of all, I just wanted to show you what's going on, kind of news from the front line with Zaha Hadid Architects. There's a lot of new stuff which hasn't been seen. I just kind of raced through some of those images. Then I also wanted to not show you images and the design of the installation. That I leave you to be discovered on Friday, but I want to show that what we're doing here in the installation is embedded in an ongoing research project, which is to do with shell structures and tensile structures, or kind of surface active architectural articulations. And they're part of an attempt of Zaha Hadid Architects to mature our repertoire and to some extent is a kind of allowing the kind of otherwise wildly proliferating repertoire to be disciplined through structural constraint, material logics, fabrication logics, environmental constraints. I think that's part of a maturation process, which allows us then also to bring this work into the mainstream and execute these projects. And the installation here is a welcome opportunity to move that research into the built reality. Okay, but before we, so the first part of the lecture is just giving you some news. One of the news items is that Zaha Hadid Architects has now a new building in London, and we picked up this building, and it has this kind of corner shop, if you like, a double heights space where we're showing kind of our designs, product designs, furniture design, etc. So that's happening. We've manipulated a little bit. We created the staircase with this just hanging. Each individual step is hanging down and made from fiber concrete. And on the lower floor, there's more going on. We're going into jewelry, into textiles. And we also have a pop-up hair salon. We had that during this London Design Week, and we have it again now during Freeze. So we believe that all design is communication, urbanism, architecture, interior design, furniture design, product design, fashion design, and to some extent also, hairstyling belongs to that as well. So it's a kind of totality of the built environment and the world of artifacts is what we have a competency and claim competency, and the discipline we all participating in is the kind of needle's eye and discourse through which all the phenomena of this world need to be threaded and going through, and we are guiding all of that. We also want to mention that we're having an exhibition at the moment in Madrid, and we've invited by Elena Foster, Norman Foster's wife. She has this Madrid in Ivory Press and the gallery in Madrid, where we're showing some of our stuff. And I wanted to point out and show you that we've opened a number of buildings this year. So this is a project which was started, the competition was won 10 years ago. And it took a long time to execute. It's a very robust piece of architecture. It's 100% section-based. It's only operates through section, and these sections just extruded through, so in plan it's totally orthogonal. Nothing much happening. And in terms of the semiological project, I just want to point out that we are presenting here in elevation the different segments of the institution. So here we have a library, an archive, regional offices, an auditorium, and we then kind of, the gaps between those are the public circulation all the way to a roof garden here. And we then over-coding or redundantly second-coding this with the different louvers. So the public areas have the black louvers, and windows into the functional spaces have these golden louvers. So this already before we've kind of explicitly posited the semiological project, we have here kind of semiotic encoding already operating in this project, kind of an intuitive thing, which comes intuitively to many architects. This is again that auditorium pulling out. It's all done in prefab concrete. You step in under that kind of projecting auditorium volume, and then you kind of move sectionally through the building where the circulation flows sectionally. That's in Montpellier, south of France. There's another building. So buildings at Zaha Hadid Architects come in families. It's also a library building in Vienna. Again, this idea of different volumes. Here we're talking about a library on the one hand and the kind of light gray, so set off in color coding terms, central student center, and then again the gap area is all the public spaces. And these two are kind of intermeshing jigsaw of these two meandering figures, and then you come in and to a central space underneath, and you find these gaps slicing through with public facilities on different levels. And that is currently completing the shell. We also, on our drawing boards, the Central Bank for Iraq, a tower in the base of which is actually the vaults, the money. It's a solid tower which then kind of flares out. Structure equals, in this case, brise-soleil. So we're having a double referencing of these fins and the whole thing on the Tigris, opening up with a kind of grand navigation space up the building with these kind of panoramic elevators. Also on our drawing boards, this kind of twin towers, hotel and offices, and a conferencing center in Nanjing. We also just submitted, and it seems we've lost the competition for a new tower at Park Avenue in New York. There's a kind of thick base which contains trading floors, a grand entrance, and then in the transition we created these kind of garden and multi-level social spaces which are shared, and then on top extruding the more regular floors. Here we have literally outdoor gardens into this transition. You step in, there's a kind of atrium connecting up to the middle transition public space, which looks like this. It's also ongoing on-site for quite a while already, the Energy Research Center in Riyadh. It's kind of field project with offices, conference center, library, prayer space, and covered outdoor areas connecting all this. All oriented with respect to shaded courtyards and scoops catching wind, so it's a strong environmental morphology, which also is engineered through to kind of LEED Platinum. A lot of small windows only to the exterior and shaded courtyards. So that's going on. An airport, we're still in the middle of a competition. I don't want to tell you where it is, but it's a major effort on our part to compete on a big international airport. And we just, after a year of effort, we just heard that we've lost against Jean Nouvel on the National Museum of China, the 120,000 square meter big museum on the axis close to the bird's nest. We've gone through a number of designs. This was design number one. We then created a series of variations second version. Both versions share, you enter in from underneath, and there are basically two parts, a permanent and a temporary collection, and a series of exterior terrace spaces addressing the park. It's the project with a circular and a square atrium condition, if you like. Has been very much elaborated. This is the underside and the top side. A huge effort of competition for over 1 year of work. So I just feel I should show it sometimes, because usually these kind of lost competition disappear. But this one is ongoing. This is another, it's even bigger, 180,000 square meter of cultural center with opera house, art museum, and exhibition center in Chengdu, China. By the way, more than half of our projects are now in China, and the total volume is, in terms of square meterage, is maybe like 3/4. And what started with diagrams like this is kind of finally materializing, the big commercial complex in Beijing. So this kind of space of hyper communication, hyper orientation, where as you, with each step, about kind of 50 to 100 destinations present themselves to you in 4 of these volumes connected by bridges, and opening at the end of this once in Beijing. And some of what the rendering promised is happening. The kind of Pyrenean depth, layeredness of the space is of interest, but then again, through the curvilinearity and the continuity of curvature, you kind of facilitates, I think, orientation and navigation. And then there's a series of internal atriums coming off this exterior space, which then reconnects through the bridges. At night. We also seeing the closing in on with the completion of our project in the center of Seoul. It's an exhibition center with a design museum, design library, and the idea here is that the park, which is kind of launches itself, is kind of pulled up onto the building. And on the other hand, there is a kind of overhang of the building over a kind of covered plaza. And I'm proud to show the completion of the cultural center in Baku, Azerbaijan. It's 90,000 square meter, a park, a library, museum, conferencing center. Some of you might have noticed that this building caught fire, but everything is under control and we're completing. It was something, a big kind of smoke cloud was shocking, but it seems all going back to progress, to finish now. The building looks different from all sides, but always recognizable. Has a lot of, pulls you in many ways into its ambit and from all sides. Up to 80 meters at this point with the library. So it's kind of in all directions porous and inviting, and spawning exterior spaces all around it itself. It's all executed, and this is literally the same material driving out into the landscape. Some of the interiors, the entrance condition, the main lobby leading up, the ramp leading up into the museum. Also the inside-outside relationships are interesting. The whole structure is that kind of curvilinear space frame which dips down and picks up again without columns. The museum. The library and the kind of cascading of terraces into that 80-meter tip. The conferencing center with a kind of conference hall and music hall, in fact. Okay, so that was part one. Part two is that research where, for instance, with the Baku project, we created kind of, there's shell action, there's space frame, shell action, but it hasn't been optimized in terms of algorithmic structural form finding. And now we're going into kind of more research which makes these kind of types of projects more disciplined, I would argue. And we're, at the same time, it remains quite open-ended. So we looked at Gothic vaulting, ribbing, and one of the projects, and now we're looking at student projects a lot, as well as Zaha Hadid Architects projects in different teaching arenas, whether it's the AADRL, the Angewandte, or Innsbruck, plus our own research group and competitions. This is a kind of cycle of interconnected researches, where also people who were students feed into the firm and continue their research. So this is, for instance, the project where we studied the Gothic, and we love, of course, the intricacy of detail, the coherency of articulation. But then how can we go beyond that? Instead of the kind of repetition of base you find in the Gothic down the nave, a kind of parametric variation. Also this idea of turning the beauty of the inside and making it visible on the exterior as well, and expanding the repertoire from compression into tension systems. So this was one of the DRL projects, kind of parametric variation of the arches and walls, interested in particular profiling and cluster columns as well, and then some just final images of that project, integrating exterior and interior spaces, compression and tensile members, etc. Another experiment from AADRL, these kind of sand cones intersecting to create vaulting structures. And this is always paralleled often then with material experiments. That's why we, at AADRL, we always start, in fact, with material experimentation, meteorological, and then kind of translate those into digital simulations to work with. Some of our work at Zaha Hadid Architects. The first of these competitions where we tried to work with shells was, and clusters of shells and whole fields of shells, was for a competition in China for artists and creative industry colony. You're looking already at grid shells or at edge reinforcements, etc. This is already a few years old, this project. Then we went through a shell which kind of pulls off from columns. And this was a competition for Toledo, a museum for archaeology. And a similar kind of approach of arrays of shells lifting off on columns and then starting to slice in courtyards as well as open up pergola styles for all those shells. And then studying also the lighting conditions. This research continues into kind of clusters of shells, the attempt to pile shells upon shell, moving from parabuloid shells to creased shells, and those kind of clusterings and nesting. And these are kind of formal studies which then lead to projects like this. This is a competition for the Parliament of Abu Dhabi. The kind of layeredness of shells. And also the attempt to try to bring this thinking into a tower typology. This was in the context of a university campus where we had various lower buildings to be combined with towers, and to make a kind of coherent language, we tried to see if we can make sense of interim vaulting to tie together a structure and to also create special spaces in such a tower. And again, clusters of shells of different sizes, creased and curved or smooth. This was a kind of university campus for Morocco. So you can see it's quite an extensive series of competitions which, since all of them have been lost, they kind of tend to kind of disappear under the carpet. So I'm glad to have that occasion to show some of that work. This was also a lost competition for the cabinet offices, or Prime Minister's office and cabinet for Baghdad, also on the Tigris. It's a bit more formal, but in kind of arrays and fields of vaults and shells. No? And then partly pulling up also in multi-level wings of offices. And I intercept that with, for instance, the project one of my students at Innsbruck did. So these kind of research is migrating, as I said, from the office to AA, to Innsbruck, to Vienna. And the techniques, of course, which are facilitating that are shared. And the algorithms are shared, and tools are shared. And this was project where we're going into structural analysis of various kinds. These are all form found and optimized, different ways of tessellating, which might be skin, which might be grid shell, which might be for the sake of perforation. And the edge is always a critical condition in these shells, the open edge, the unsupported edges. And then also environmental criteria brought to bear in terms of the perforations. This is an airport project for Innsbruck. And one of the most sophisticated projects, back to Zaha Hadid Architects. This is a presidential palace for Algiers, a project we have and working on and worked through these earlier sketches, and they're engineered through by now. So a lost competition leads to a kind of gained or won project. And here we going for the first time into ribbing algorithms, which follow the idea of flow, forces flow down along the steepest slope. And articulating those ribs. This was working with AKT, it's a real project. Different ways of articulating the ribs, maybe as grooves, as ribs, or as perforations, or as creases. And also the introduction of courtyards. And here the attempt to also tease out the ornamental power of these ribbings and perforations in structuring the space. So this is the whole setup, the presidential palace, the president's residence, set of ministries in a kind of one of those green hills of the green city of Algiers. An attempt to give kind of character and articulation to the different spaces. President's residence. And again, to compare, so we picked up on that and used some of those techniques and forms for the airport I was talking about earlier. And again, at the same time, or following on from that, we have at the Angewandte continuous research in the same direction as AA, as the office, as Innsbruck. So these kind of fields of shells, fields of columns leading into fields of shells. Also material research with latex, with hanging models, with fabric, etc. And then leading from material experiments into computational experiments. Also looking back at the long history of vaulting and shell structures. And then translating that into kind of new world. And we used the Rio Olympic Park as a kind of site to try out some of these fields. So this is all kind of Vienna, Angewandte, Hadid-Klasse. And I want to show it, so this is kind of quite proliferous and experimental, and the attempt to kind of load up a structural rigor and environmental rigor at a certain point, but obviously these as a vertical studio, you have very young students mixing in with older students. And at Innsbruck, I've done the same kind of project, but there we have I'm working with individuals, not with groups, and they're a bit more mature, so we're creating diploma projects. For instance, this one. So again, Rio Olympics is a cluster of stadia as shells, environmental issues of shading and lighting. The different stadia kind of intersect and fuse and create interesting in-between spaces. The whole thing is a kind of space frame we developed similar to the one we had at Baku. And some interesting ideas about the way the audience is kind of articulated in these kind of leaves. And a whole series of different stadia has been worked through: tennis court and velodrome, etc. Of course, also just quickly flicking through our Olympic swimming pool, which now finally we've taken off those horrible brackets, which were kind of incarcerating the piece to have additional 15,000 seats as temporary seats, and now it will kind of come to life as this kind of elegant pavilion in the Olympic Park. Post-Olympics. Back to some more studies with the group in Vienna. terms of these kind of fields of shells, and you can kind of paint on different degrees of rigidity and differentiate the field and develop a kind of repertoire and quickly test through various multi-shell conditions, intersecting shells, layered shells. You can see here that I'm trying to oscillate between kind of proliferation of ideas and then a kind of disciplining and application, which is finally always found for most of these ideas. Here again, the play with flow lines, water flow lines, interpreted as ribbing lines, because the way the water flows down the surface is, in fact, the way forces could be channeled down, and then the kind of perforating out into elegant ribbing structures. And again, switching over to a project, Zaha Hadid Architects, a competition we seemingly have won, but it's not 100% confirmed, so I will not tell you where this is. It's a parliament building with 2 chambers and a series of administrative and members of parliament offices, kind of in a park. And a large ensemble section. The different halls of one chamber, and looking back from one of the offices. Some more Vienna work, inspiration also in the kind of biomimetic inspiration from mushrooms and their kind of ribbing condition. Translated observation of different styles of ribbing which are prevalent, a kind of inverted dome, and creating a kind of field out of these. Okay, now we're coming to closer to the installation work. This is the Biennale space, where we focused precisely on this kind of shell research and showed it at the Venice Biennale. Here is, on the side is all the Vienna models, so we invited the students. This is a centerpiece which we created. Here's a student work, showing that in context of the work of Candela and Isla. There's historical precedents, and also showing precedents, some of the installation work. Shajay Bhushan, who's been working with us for many years and was a student at the EARL, is now pushing this research group at ZHA and also is in charge here of the installation. Some of the installations he's done earlier on. And back to Vienna, where we're trying to combine solid shells with grid shells. But more importantly, I was interested in the continuity between solid shells and tensile structures, to have surface continuity between rigid shells and tensile structures, and use the rigid shell to suspend the tensile membrane and to have this kind of continuity, like in this model. We first studied at Vienna, and then our original proposal for the Venice Biennale's installation was in fact to have that rigid shell connected with the tensile net, which would then be tessellated with aluminum shingles, whereas is an aluminum shell. But in the end, we decided but this would have required a kind of rim. In the end, we decided to only go with the origami pleated shell because we could show the strength of the material without any edge beam. It's just 1 millimeter aluminum, pleated, kind of cut, scored, and pleated by robots, and then in pieces, and then bolted together with one kind of open end. So this is a pattern. It's similar. It picks up on these kind of mushrooms we created with a tensile structure, but this had an internal structure at the time. And these are a pure surface structure without any additional framing or internal structure. So this is the way it works. The robot cuts the sheets, scores them, and then bends the pieces. So the importance here is that we generate complex three-dimensional geometry without molds, just based on this intricate information model and instructions to the robot. These are the pieces, and then the process of bolting them together was still obviously an elaborate hand process. It showed that we can anticipate, first of all, the geometric intricacy. All these elements are different. It's not a rotation body, it continuously changes as we go around, and also particularly important, the engineering aspect, the kind of stability and softness of this was anticipated with the help of Biro Happold. We also were showing at the same time a series of older shell projects like the Baku project, the Aquatic Center, the Chanel Pavilion, some of the Innsbruck shells. This is Baku again. And this one I wanted to show is a new project we're doing in Hyde Park. It belongs to the Serpentine Gallery, but there's another old building, kind of former ammunition storage. So these are Innsbruck's, before I get there, some of these Candela Shells. And we've been visiting Mexico and visiting most of his churches. And this is a fantastic project, 4 independent hyper shells, only on 4 points, then breaking out and only connected by glass at the top. Some of Isla's fantastic shells. There's a whole collection we brought to Venice from the Isla archive. He died about 2 years ago. And some of his kind of contraptions to test the geometry and structural capacity of the geometry. And some of these unbelievably thin shells he created in Switzerland. Literally hundreds of those exist in Switzerland. The same with Candela. These people have been unbelievably proliferous because these were highly economic, highly efficient ways of creating these spaces. I mean, Candela has done literally hundreds and hundreds and both such structures in Mexico and the US, and similarly Isla. This is the work of Philip Bloch from ETH, who've been inviting over to Vienna, and we've been collaborating with, and he's created this fantastic research of stone vaults, which can take any complex form, and a kind of geometric analysis allows him to predict structural behavior. And he's creating one of those structures now in Texas, full scale, only with cut stone, no mortar, no steel, no reinforcement, just through compression. This is the model of that project. And he shows an animation which I don't have here, where he's kind of poking this, and you can see how these stones kind of work with each other, and how they flip back into an original position unless he's kind of pushing too far, and suddenly all of these elements kind of tumble. It's in one big rain down. So here again, the overall installation. And now we're coming to the project here, which is in principle a tensile membrane which acts structurally. It's for the magazine in Hyde Park. It's an extension. We're also renovating the inside here into an art gallery, and this will be the social space. And the structure is an edge beam and steel columns only connected by that structural membrane. Some of the renderings. There will be a second internal membrane, and the thing is, it's a permanent building, fully insulated, with a glass edge. These are those columns which bring in light to the interior under construction. These were the columns created out of segments and welded together. Okay. So volume 1, in fact, is largely a discourse analysis of the discipline, how architecture constitutes itself. And Eric is right, I'm calling it the autopoiesis of architecture because I believe there's a single global discourse. Architecture is world architecture, and to some extent has been since the Renaissance. And so I'm discussing how architecture evolves through drawing as its medium, through theoretical reflection and publication, as a system of communication, as a discourse. What are its categories, its methods, values, evaluating criteria, etc. And then and all of this theorizing of the discipline is embedded in communication theory. And that's and when it comes to volume 2, it becomes less descriptive, reflective, and more projective, and to some extent normative, when I'm trying to outline how the discipline should now develop and upgrade its intelligence to meet the challenge of contemporary society, which I characterize as post-Fordist network society, which is characterized by kind of an intensification of communication. It could also has been called a knowledge society, where I believe that the problems we face are ultimately always and mostly communication problems. All our conundrums and the bottlenecks are always bottlenecks in process of communication. And so I'm theorizing the built environment as a facilitating stratum of communication, the way it distributes activities and in a navigable, orientable way, the way the built environment sorts us and gathers us into the different communicative situations and patterns of cooperation which we as a society rely on being reproduced and being evolving. That the built environment is that kind of system of signification which we read, navigate. It needs to be legible, it needs to be well ordered. So I'm saying that the societal function of architecture is the innovative ordering and framing of communicative interaction. So it's really how we are coming together to cooperate to reproduce the material plenty, freedom and charity which we all depend on. So I think there is progress, and this progress is hugely dependent, of course, on the intricacy and intensity of communication, which keeps all this kind of going and evolving and progressing. So architectural frames, the design settings and spaces are themselves communications. They're in fact invitation to join particular activities and enter these activities with into particular constellations with particular expected modes of behavior which are appropriate for particular situations. So we have to communicate in specific situations, and we can only find these and are kind of structured by the way the spaces are connected and laid out and internally configured. So these are communications that define, premise, and prime the communicative interactions that are expected to take place within the respectively framed territory. Each territory or frame is embedded within a context and system of frames that can be understood and designed as a system of signification. That's the project. I think that's always already happening, but in a very fragmented way. And I think architects and designers are always intuitively know that they're intervening within a system of signification into kind of semiotic code. But that is, I guess, for the next stage where society becomes more and more complex, where communication has to be more dense, more intricate, more varied, and we have to pack into every hour and every day of our lives more meaningful engagements and interactions to stay a kind of productive. We need the built environment to be more complex and more legible at the same time. And I think that that's only possible on the basis of parametricism. If you look at the history of architecture from the Renaissance to the Baroque, neoclassicism, modernism, postmodernism, deconstructivism, you can find, particularly when you look at modernism, that the degrees of freedom have expanded, that there's more versatility of the architect to kind of respond to and adapt to complex conditions, right? But so when we're moving from kind of classical architecture to modernism, we have new degrees of freedom. We're no longer tied in with symmetry and proportion. We can stretch out of proportion. We can compose dynamic equilibrium compositions or kind of nearly amorphous compositions. So but these new degrees of freedom in effect mean that these compositions are less organized. So with more complexity and more versatility has to be paid for by a lack of organization, by a form of disorganization, if you like, so organizational degeneration, if you like. And as we move from modernism to postmodernism into the mode of collage, again, we're enriching the repertoire. We have more chance to articulate the diversity of society or give space to diversity of society. But again, there is a kind of further degeneration of order and organization. With deconstructivism, even more. Again, it's an expansion of the repertoire, and at the same time, less and less organized the environment. It makes it more chaotic and becomes really this kind of visual chaos, illegible. And I think it's only with parametricism for the first time that we can combine a further extension of the repertoire, a further degree of versatility, lightfootedness, adaptability, versatility in the repertoire, combine that with the higher forms of organization, with a more ordered environment. Precisely through the ability to build up this complexity through associative logics and build in correlations, build in so that every action has a reaction, and you kind of tighten a network of dependencies and interarticulations which make the built environment orientable, navigable, legible for the first time. So we'll come back to that. But I want to go back more fundamentally that all built environments, even before the advent of architecture, meaning with the beginning of settlement structures, which were initially fall under the category of the vernacular, if you like, of the unplanned and undesigned. Even at this stage, all the way through, we have the fact that a social order requires a spatial order, that society only evolves with a built environment, that architecture, in this sense, or the built environment, is a necessary substrate of societal evolution. And and that's actually the move of of the animal kingdom and the becoming of man through building up across generations kind of social order by using the built environment as the plane of inscription. Through trial and error, a cumulative buildup of order. And so you can create social organisms, if you like, which are more complex, more ordered, and also larger than what would have been possible with a flock of apes, which has to start new with every generation, if you like, and doesn't have a built environment along which it kind of build itself up into an organized structure. And you can find these kind of most primitive settlements, the increase of size. What I also want to point out here is that the built environment is kind of ordering, differentiating the group into different categories, and it differentiates and lays out different activities, and therefore constructs this kind of societal memory and the ability to build up these routines. So you have laid out different categories of participants and different activities. But this is not only a kind of spatial ordering, it is also a kind of ornamental marking, where we have the different actors and the different categories of the social body or social organization being distinguished through ornamental markings. And I think we're moving from organization, which is simply laying out, separating out, and arranging, to a kind of morphological differentiation. We're moving into the kind of semiotic code, if you like. And that is not only happening with respect to the human body, so the distinctions are made manifest, and I mean, this still happens today, of course, with the fashion system, with the emphasis, the difference between male and female is kind of poignant. You can go through the crowd, you can navigate where the students, where the business people, where workers, where different milieus and life attitudes, and that's what you need to go by when you quickly want to find relevant communication partners. But what is interesting here is that this kind of ornamental marking is also migrating onto the space and buildings themselves. And there is no society which doesn't have these kind of things going, and no society which doesn't have these kind of things going. So it becomes a necessary mechanism of building up social order and having a kind of ordered and organized social cooperation. Now I'm jumping ahead. So when in the 60s, modernism went in the 70s, let's say, modernism went into a crisis. Modernism as a built environment adapting to kind of mechanized mass reproduction society, into a society which became more diversified with faster innovation. We had the slogan, architecture must speak. The kind of monotony of the built environment was seen to be mute and no longer able to register the emergent differentiation of society. So the attempt to kind of bring back this, say, ornamental marking and to differentiate more and build some kind of a semiotic code. This is the first time also in the history of architecture that we have an explicit reflection. Well, it's actually not quite true, but the first time that semiology and semiotics was incorporated into architectural discourse. Semiology was actually founded about 100 years ago in the late 19th century, early 20th century, and then 50 years later it was brought into architecture. Although in architectural theory there has been in the 18th and 19th century a discourse on ornament, decoration, already with respect to expression and character, and the characterization of, appropriate characterization of different social strata and different activity types. So there is a precedent for that in the history of architectural theory. But the attempt to bring in semiology was very strong in the 60s and 70s. It did not kind of really get hold of and persist. Now, if you look at how postmodernism evolved into deconstructivism, and for me, is it not just an opposition, at the same time an evolution, you can see, for instance, in here in Schumi's Parc de la Villette, in the Follies, the attempt to kind of differentiate and build the Follies and build up a kind of complexity, although it's not an explicit language. And at the same time, Eisenman is talking about building up a formal syntax, although he was rejecting a semantic layer. And but I still believe that we have here deconstructivism, a kind of a buildup of complexity, which at the same time degenerates into kind of disorder and visual chaos quite quickly, because these layers are just indifferent to each other. They're just interpenetrating, superimposed without predictability, resonance, interarticulation. And 10 years after this was in 82, 83, we were inspired by this and did the studio at Columbia University where we're trying to build up these layers, and these are functionally specific city layers. We had worked with and build them up into some kind of complex layered system. Of course, it's kind of indigestible chaos seemingly, but there is an attempt here certainly to have degrees of correlation and also gradient differentiation in each layer, and then kind of action-reaction between layers. So the first intuition of that, what later on became the kind of parametricist concept of multiple subsystems which are in effect resonate with each other, which in effect are derived from each other as transcodings of each other, and in the end are representations of each other. That's not the case here yet, but there's a glimpse of that. In the meantime, you can see that we've kind of evolved a language, the Zaha Hadid Architects, which is also the 90s, which was more ordered, more organized, but perhaps at that point less layered. Okay, so back to this notion that the societal function of architecture is the innovative ordering and framing of communicative interaction. And I'm distinguishing three registers within which I think the discipline has to upgrade its game. And these are the components of what I call in the end architectural order. So I'm saying organization is this kind of the higher complexity in the diagrams, in the physical distribution, objective spatial orders. Articulation is then that which reflects the necessity that these organizations need to be navigated by actors which have perceptive capacities, so that they actually have to actively move through these organizations and need to be able to decompose the scene into some kind of meaningful, for them, meaningful functional unities. That's articulation. First of all, phenomenological articulation in terms of perception, but also there's a need to articulate the environment with respect to meanings, semiologically, the semantic layer. So I think they will become clearer, because these for me then are three projects: the project of organization, the project of phenomenological articulation, and the project of semiological articulation. And I start with organization, which is just simply these kind of pattern that we need a richer repertoire of organizational patterns at our fingertips when we're engaging, for instance, in the design of a complex, of an urban district or a complex building. And there we just kind of develop categories, notions, catalogs, descriptions, a repertoire of terms with which we kind of upgrade our organizational game. Because I believe that there is a lack of this explicit intelligence in the discipline. And I've been working on this for a number of while, so you can have the same set of points differently connected. Each of these has different quantitative aspects, but also different qualitative aspects. So this kind of connection pattern would obviously generate a very strong center, which would polarize a community which moves in and give kind of hierarchy to this, whereas the kind of grid would be it sets out a series of equal places. So these have different quantitative aspects and different sociological imports, if you like. So we need to be aware of this, and I mean there has been research by Otto, for instance, about how different points can be connected with a minimal path system that would be the shortest network of lines which could connect all points. This is, of course, the direct line from all to all and the longest network, if you like. And then there's a kind of minimized detour system which you find in medieval cities, in fact. And this is what he's reproducing with his wool thread model. And we've been working on this, and you can see here that there is a kind of sweet spot precisely where these optimized detour systems optimize between these two categories, the length of total system and imposed average detour. But there's also the question not only of path systems and having organizational tools and concepts to develop our intelligence, but also the way the parcels and cells and rooms might be arrayed, and also in terms of circulatory systems, routing and rerouting. And so this is on the level of, let's say, the plan diagram, if you like, or the objective geometric order of the built environment, and to have objective measures, comparisons, and just the repertoire to feed your design imagination. I think very important is, equally important, I think, is as well that we develop an understanding that if you generate a complex objective organization, the question is it phenomenologically decomposable? Can actors orient within them? Can they build mental maps? Can they do key features and units of interaction become perceptually palpable and conspicuous? So we need to, in fact, make that an explicit aspect of our design intelligence, this reflection on the perceptual comprehension, if you like, of the built environment. Because if you look at these kind of the visual chaos which is produced by this kind of garbage spill mode of urban development which we're observing, and this kind of collaging which gives us degrees of freedom but generates visual chaos, and in the end disorientation, where you waste your time running around in circles not knowing what's going on where. And we need to kind of develop intelligence about perceptually palpable and comprehensible environment. We're working with object parameters in terms of our parametric models. We need to bring in ambient parameters, lighting conditions, etc., but also observer parameters, where we can reflect and test how the different constellations appear from different observers. And that simply means that an objective arrangement, in a sense, even in this plan view, is always has particular readings. So here we see a kind of a certain number of dots, but we also see lines. Here, horizontal lines, here, vertical lines, here, horizontal lines. Simply on the basis of proximity. So we kind of decomposing the scene, or we constructing units, which might then be functional units for us. So what are the unities within the system? And here, if we bring in similarity, that trumps in a sense proximity, and we have, in effect, horizontal lines which we're reading. And these kind of arrays, you can see that in that we perceive kind of a series of concentric domains, even though there is no physical contiguity here. And we just go through this kind of, and I'm going through it in the book, we appropriating the teachings of Gestalt psychology, the psychology of perception, which we need to understand how we would usually expect observers to decompose a figure. So this is usually understood as crossing of two lines rather than these two figures or these two figures coming together. Although both of these are possible. So there's an inherent ambiguity, and you can say that there is no such thing as an objective organization. There's always that loop through perceptual decomposition. Or you can see here, we usually would privilege, so here we privilege continuity of line, here we privilege closure of body. So we decompose this into a square with two lines rather than two Ks or an M and a W. But of course, we can see that it could also be possible to see it like this, and it would be a totally different organization, the organization of two opposing elements rather than one element framed by two secondary elements. And you can see here how strongly we react to symmetries. And the symmetry effect is the strongest the more asymmetrical amorphous is that which is mirrored over. And that becomes quite a powerful device if you want to draw attention and make complexes conspicuous and be read as unities. There's this whole discourse of isolating figures in a field and drawing figures and fragments or stuff into configurations. And this is always a mental perceptual act. So maybe it's quite difficult, it could be anything. But if you tell you that this is Picasso's woman with a guitar, you might start to see perhaps a guitar here, maybe here. And if you see first this and then that, then you get kind of help. You can see that you could also, as you move through spaces, this kind of image would prime you to read this in a particular way. So you can also sequence constellations and make more ambiguous and fragmented constellations still legible if you bring people through an image like this into an image like that. And then there are all these kind of effects we've heard about and known about, and which might be relevant for differentiating objects which are objectively the same relative to different contexts in which they appear. So these dots have all the same shade of gray. And these have the same shade of color. And we've used some of that in some of our installations, by the way. And also this, where you want to see coherent figures. I think a lot of the cubist and purist paintings are about this kind of game of how to decompose the scene, which again is an act of perceptual synthesis, And I'm interested in creating built environments which have that level of ambiguity, so there are multiple readings present which could be delivered to different audiences which find each its own meaning in the kind of set of constellations. So it seems to be a kind of guitar on a table, but then you can see that the body of the guitar disappears. There's a pile of plates, and this is nothing but like a kind of armchair pushed against the table. Some of these elements which we would inclined to see as tensioning devices for the guitar strings become tops of the bottles, tops of glass. And you can see here that the kind of pseudo bottle emerges between a part of the book and the top of the glass is assimilated and affiliated to the bottle here. So there's a kind of pseudo bottle emerging. So here we can see in this painting by Le Corbusier, it's kind of fascinating game of what constitutes the units of interaction in a scene. How do you decompose a scene into a meaningful arrangement? You can navigate, approach, and find your space, find your territory to interact. And that depends on perhaps in space, rather than looking at a flat image, this could depend on observer position. So something kind of fragments or comes together particular moments. And we've been working on this in a number of studios in Yale and Vienna. For instance, here we have a cluster of towers in this case, which from different views looks rather different, but it's the same cluster. So here we have an animation. This is objectively the same process observed from different camera positions. So you can see here that the towers seem to be opening up at the top. Here they seem to be opening up at the bottom, and here at the middle. Or we have these kind of studies where you have an objective square grid transmuting into a circle packing on the basis of shifting camera positions. You can work with these effects. And here we have the opposite. We have, in fact, a circle packing in plan, which then through camera shifts its angle against the camera, transmutes into a square grid or a waving pattern. Objectively, these are objectively stable geometries. The same here, where we have again, there is the object is stable and stiff, and what we're observing here is apparent movement induced by camera movement and the kind of reconfiguration into different units and objects, kind of perceptual objects. But in a sense, all objects are perceptual objects, particularly in a built environment where you cannot take an object and pull it against and shift it against the background. Everything is kind of baked together and fixed together. So what is an object and what is another object, where a space begins or one space stops, another begins, is always a question of interpretation and perceptual decomposition. Okay, so we have the parametric organization. This is the parametric phenomenology, and now we're talking about parametric semiology. And I believe that every design project has these three layers. We start with a partie or with this kind of build up an emergent pattern which generates an overall organization. Then we start to read and interpret and perceptually decompose this, and perhaps in multiple ways. But I think then we also need to worry about the social meaning of the different territories and features which we're offering. And that's the semiological project. So in terms of the dimensions which I'm distinguishing here, these are the three tasks of the design project. The organizational project, in effect, is dealing with, constructs a kind of physical frame and understands the users as physical bodies which need to be distanced out, separated by walls, maybe connected by pathways, but it's all a question of channeling, distributing and channeling physical bodies. And this is nearly as if we would kind of channel cattle through kind of system of separations and channels of connection. The phenomenological project goes further. We're constructing a perceptual frame. We're reflecting the users as sentient beings, as capable of perception, and we reckon with their active behavior, their active movement, also active phenomenological decomposition of the scene. But I think in the next stage, the semiological project, we discuss the space and territory as a communicative frame, which considers the users as socialized actors. They have to learn the language of space. They have to be brought up in a particular semiological system. And we reckon with them as, and their response is communicative action. They're actually communicating when they, here they're just kind of, we think of a physical body just penetrating a territory. Here we finding a sentient being orienting, observing, and entering a space. But here we're thinking of the communicative action of entering a space, which is in fact the communication, which means I'm following the invitation to join an event. And when I step in, I'm communicating my presence and I behave accordingly, a socialized actor. So that's the principal setup. Now, this means that all architectural features, in a sense, contribute to the elaboration of signs. I believe that each space is a sign. It has a form and a function, a signifier and a signified, and I believe that the signified, the meaning of a space, is what takes place there, what to expect, the kind of pattern of interaction that takes place there is what it means, and that means its meaning is a function. So we're looking at these kind of signs in the visual domain, and there are these kind of sign languages. And we compared also to the spoken word, to the speech act, to the spoken language, where Wittgenstein is saying that the meaning of a word, a sign, is its use. And I'm picking up on that and say the meaning of a space is its use. And when I'm talking about the semiotics and the semiological project, I'm not in the world of Charles Jencks, where he assumes that the building symbolizes, the different features and ornaments symbolize things external to what's going on in the building. So he has Greek mythology symbolized and lots of illusions which are external to what's going on in the building. No, I think for me the domain of the signified, the domain of meaning, is restricted to what's going on in the building itself. And the distinctions of the different activities and social situations which are articulated as different happenings within the building is what the semiological system is to differentiate, and not speak about things beyond external to the institution which is being accommodated. So form signifies function, and that is a signifying relation. It's not a matter of physical performance only, because spaces perform through their communicative powers. They need to be understood in order to fulfill their function. So how is that possible? So how does anything acquire meaning? And the point here is that all meanings are constituted through distinctions. within system of differences. And that brings us to what I'm also rehearsing in the book, the structural linguistics of de Saussure, where he is in a sense showing that the world of forms is somehow correlated with the world of meanings. In that stitch-up, discrete forms emerge for the first time. So it's not that you have you can distinguish forms in advance of them having meaning, but only because they have meaning, you can recognize them as this versus that form. So there's a kind of strange double bind or mutual dependency of in this kind of relationship of forms and their meaning. The same operates within the spoken language, in fact. You can only actually pick out properly one word versus another word, cat versus cad, something like this, when there is a kind of corresponding meaning difference. And when you hear, and without this kind of correlation, the world of forms or the world of sounds becomes a kind of indiscriminate and indistinguishable blur. So if you hear a foreign language, you often have this kind of problem of listening comprehension. It all kind of fuses into kind of indistinguished cloud of sound. You can't even pick out the different words because they're only kind of cut out and become crisp through their being tied and correlated with particular uses. And when you look at different languages, you can see that the key is here how the world of meaning and the world of objects is constituted in its distinctiveness through the language. So there's mutual dependency. And each language cuts the universe into particular categories and subcategories. And so these meanings are, in a sense, created and constituted with the language. I think that's an important point, which means that you have a kind of freedom of constructing a language as a system of distinctions. You're not bound by particular classes, types of objects you would have to denote, but you are slicing up the amorphous continuum of the world into categories by means of these verbal forms. And this shows here that sometimes between different languages there is no translatability because they're slicing up the world in certain segments of the world in different ways. Okay. I'm looking also at case studies, for instance, how some visual languages have been operating, like the traffic system. And what I'm coming to here is to say that my ambition here is, in terms of the architectural semiotics, to create complex signs which are made out of multiple components. So they're not just, for instance, a simple 5-color coding encoding 5 types of function as a kind of singular carryover, where each sign is a kind of undifferentiated part of a manifold, like it's just this versus that color, but where the sign is built up of several components. So it has a shape, it has a color, it has an internal figure, and these, and so it's always composed of multiple sign radicals. The sign is complex, and on that basis you can develop something like a grammar. So we have here, for instance, prevention signs, warning signs, guiding signs. You can see that it's always a question of distinctions and never the question of inherent the plausible meaning. So when I show you these three things, you don't know yet what I'm trying to distinguish here. But I could tell you, for instance, that these could be a symbol of, these are the symbols of a famous visual iconographic language of three types of industries: agriculture, industry, and trade, for instance. And that these, now getting into the Neurath's picture language, where he is using these later appear in these complex signs. He's also distinguishing 5 categories of ethnic groups. Oh, sorry, I don't have that. And later on combining them with different industries, and you build up complex composite signs. And sometimes these composite signs aggregate into larger complexes. And here the question appears of a kind of grammar that the combinations are constrained. Also the interesting potential that some individual signs could be part of 2 series. Their meaning depends on their position in the series. They never have individual meaning. It's always being part of a system of distinctions. Some signs might be part of 2 systems of distinction. So a double meaning, because they're doubly aligned in systems of distinctions. There's also this peculiarity, and that's back to that we have this ability to recognize figures. There's this kind of double miracle of recognition, if you like. That's why we have to distinguish token and type. We have to distinguish the individual instance of a sign or sign radical from its type. So here you have individual instances of the same sign. These are all A's, although they're kind of apparently radically different, but we all have the capacity to see all these A's. You can see here that the sign type is kind of strange abstraction, which gives an enormous amount of freedom how to install it and how otherwise to affiliate it. So here these were all the same letter, and here they're all different letter, and they all seem to be so similar. So you have this kind of paradox of similarity or dissimilarity. So you can't go by kind of superficial first glances. So in terms of the registers of semiological encoding articulations which we can use in architecture when we build up an architectural language, there's first of all the differentiation of spatial position or directionality. So that already, you can already encode meaning. On the north, it's more, you have certain laws of positioning, where you say in the north, for instance, more the public areas, and the south are more the private areas, and then you notice that, and there's a systematic correlation between position or direction, and that becomes a kind of significant feature. You can then differentiate morphology, so you can have the register of shape differentiation to signify functional differentiation. And you can, of course, have further materiality, color, texture, etc. And of course, all of these are subject to phenomenological manipulation. These shapes need to be recognized, first of all, phenomenologically, before their meaning can be ascertained. And we have, of course, we are totally free in constructing these codes. and ornaments, if you like, or even constructing shape systems as coding systems, then we might as well use that which the physical necessities, the fabrication or necessities, the structural necessities, and environmental engineering necessities, what they deliver as a kind of morphological given, we can kind of take up and as our coding material. So this leads to what I call tectonic articulation, where we're trying as much as possible, rather than arbitrarily invent morphologies, to see what the technical requirements, structural requirements give us, and then of course we need to systematize that into a coherent deployment. But that has in fact always been the case in the history of architecture, that ornament comes out of, these kind of technical production necessities, where you have bricklaying courses and that turns into an ornament, where you have rustication, where you have lines of tessellation becoming ornamental. And we still do that, and I encourage that rather than an arbitrary ornamentation. So the refoundation of architectural semiology and semiotics. I'm saying what is important here is to see that the architectural sign, a full architectural communication, is only a given territory, where it makes a difference whether I'm entering or exiting, whether I'm in this or that territory with respect to then this or that activity, communicative situation. So the full communication is always a territory and not individual features like a frieze, a column, a window, an ornament. These are sign radicals, these fragments that need to come together to form a territory, and then I'm having a full communication. I make that analogy with the spoken word, where a spoken language, where only a full sentence delivers a communication, whereas individual words are sign radicals. So I say dog, nobody knows what the purpose of my speech. What I'm saying nothing, in fact. I would have to formulate a sentence to communicate, and in a similar way, analogically, I have to construct a territory out of a series of features to have a communication, so to have a full architectural sign. So then the question is, I'm establishing a territory, and what information is my language conveying about that territory? What can a territory communicate about itself? And I said it's not communicating about something outside of itself, it's communicating about itself. And it communicates, first of all, what will happen here. And that I would call the function type. But it also might communicate whose space it is, who is welcome here, who I might expect here, and that I call the social type. So these are the types of informations, the only types of informations which the architectural language has to be able to convey. And finally, the question, where am I? Where can I go from here? That's the location type. So the space might give me information, first of all, what is happening here, who is coming, who is allowed, who am I expecting, but also what is beyond that immediate territory. The territory or space might tell you what lies beyond, what other spaces I can access through here. I call this location type. So I have the sign function type, social type, location type. Most importantly, the function type is the denotation, the social type connotation, and then a kind of navigation. Clues is also what I expect from an architectural language. It's very important in the sense to constrain what I'm expecting the architectural language to communicate. So what are these function types? They are typical social situations. patterns of communicative interaction. And that's the way we, within parametricism, develop our understanding of function. It's no longer just a handful of stereotypical room types, a kind of schedule of accommodation which says in a school, for instance, classroom, corridor, lecture hall, sports hall or something, and that's it. We're talking now about something like parametrically variable interaction scenarios. So we're having much more nuanced distinction between the types of interaction one might engage in, and they might be kind of dynamic and ordered along gradients of nuance. I think that's very important. For instance, but we do start with kind of an overall set of categories. For instance, a lecture where all oriented to one, like here in this space, a seminar where all are oriented to all, a workshop where many are oriented to many in kind of clusters which keep shifting, a library where maybe all separate from all. So I'm focusing here on how different function types are actually creating different constellations and different relationships between participants. And that's the key which I think we have to start consider, because we're going to model in the end these functions. We're not writing labels in there, but we will start to model participates in these spaces to get a handle on the interaction scenarios which unfold within them. And we're looking at different categories or degrees. For instance, close communication, 1 to 3 person, intimate versus personal versus social versus public in larger groups, and then trying to kind of symbolize in a field, again with kind of, we can also see this as a kind of gradient, so we're no longer restricted to a handful of strict categories, and then kind of distribute these in a field. These are kind of studies of students working with these notions. So when the question comes up, how do you learn such a language? How do you learn? And I would argue you learn by encountering the coherent correlations in use. So by paying attention to the systematic differences, differences that make a difference with respect to what takes place. So if you pick out and notice that certain features, certain vaulting, certain types of floors, hard floor versus carpeted floor, certain is used and reused to emphasize particular distinctions within a kind of coherent built environment, you can kind of pick up those meanings as you learn a language through use, through listening, through encountering this language in use. So I don't believe that one would have to issue kind of detailed dictionary and instruction menu, but that you will be able to intuitively grasp the meaning of such a systemically built up grammar and system of signification. Although you could also imagine that in a corporate environment, an organization might also have such instructions, and to help in the end, what the point here is that the architectural, intricately articulated environment helps to order social processes, because people can navigate according to these semiotic rules and find each other, fall into the right behavior, gather in the right patterns and moods and modes, and therefore the overall social process is structured through such a complex built environment. So, and I was saying earlier that the territory is a kind of unit which is for the first time a full communication, and a territory is not necessarily a closed room. It could be a certain zone which separates itself out, like that plinth here. It can be articulated through ceiling, through all sorts of mechanisms. We're talking about now continuously differentiated fields which distributes along gradients different territorial conditions. These are all communicating different situations, different expectations, and in a sense they communicate, and when you enter such a territory, you accept the communication of that territory. You accept to participate and behave according to what is expected, if you like. Or you reject the communication, you pass it by, and you do not enter the territory. It's in a similar, like in the spoken language, you confront it with a statement as a communication, you either accept and continue to discuss on its basis, or you reject the communication. Okay. We used the idea of a university campus to construct totally from scratch, totally artificial, without relying on any preconceived, familiar distinctions and which might have come out of the spontaneous semiosis of the built environment, to construct fresh and with the full openness of a creative invention of an architectural language. So here, for instance, in this university campus, there's a distinction between the School of Science, School of Arts, School of Humanities, between a kind of faceted shell, a smooth shell, and a creased shell, and there's a series of sub-articulations there. So at the same time, you can have these different types of interaction type coded by these shapes, and of course, then these are combinable and building up a complex science. So you have type of shell, you have footprint shape, and then you have a series of variations in each of these. Then you have the register of, let's say, quasi-ornamental sub-articulation, but as part of a semiotic encoding, different ways of gridding, ribbing, perforating, in different shape types, and they pick up a certain meaning. And again, you can utilize through what I call tectonic articulation, the differentiations which a structural logic gives you. You see, it's how the systematic law might, for instance, accentuate the edges, the center. I think if you express and show structure, it's quite often possible to use that to characterize the space, where a large space would have large thrusting structures, where the direction of the beams will give you information in which direction the space expands most. If the beams are kind of articulated with a moment inflection, or translate the moment diagram into a kind of depth articulation, these structures will also give you a sense of where's the center of the space, for instance, if otherwise the space is obscured. So you can see here that one could use the inferences one can make and the correlations which structure and spatial form embed in a coherent system, allow that to become part of a semiotic code. Of course, it needs to be systematized and rigorously deployed. So again, here the idea of creating kind of Boolean algebra of domains within domains, domains intersecting domains, etc. And the different cluster types, and different network types. And just to give you a quick sense, the way this was built up, it was also not only the shells, but the kind of ground surface articulations, which re-territorializes and sets up a series of distinctions. And then there's a kind of vision of a university campus where you should imagine that all the significant conspicuous features and differences, and that's the emphasis, and distinctions you noticed have a systematic sociological or social distinction attached to it. So here's a kind of correlation between formal systems of differentiation and distinction with functional, performative systems of differentiation and distinctions. With the idea that every distinction you notice should mean something, and every institutional difference and interaction difference should have a kind of physical, morphological, or positional registration. As a kind of infinite project, of course, because there's always formal access which is yet to be interpreted, and then we should also expect that there are social differences which have not yet been expressed. And the final loop of reflection I want to now make that that instead of just ascribing and indicating functions here through furniture, etc., we actually want to bring in the functional component, the meaning component into the model, and we can do that by introducing agent-based parametric semiology. So we do that by crowd agent modeling, which we bring into these systems, and they are scripted to behave different in different environmental situations or according to different architectural features of the environment. And therefore the signifying correlation can be operationalized in the definition of the agent profile behaving differentially relative to environmental distinctions. So basically I'm starting to suggest that since we have now the tools, we should from now on, ideally, rather than labeling spaces and saying living room, dining room, kitchen, we should start to fill these spaces with live processes, with actors which react to situations. And you can see here, of course, in this image that there is a rather unstructured surface where anything could happen, but usually we're talking about kind of differentiated surface where certain activities are more likely than others. Not talking about a totally rigid necessarily form of encoding articulation. Could also be kind of statistical to stochastic to some extent, more likely than that event. And the kind of the capacity of crowd modeling has been developed, of course, in the engineering disciplines, but primarily concerned at the moment with evacuation, with crowd flows, with circulatory flows, primarily in terms of emergency and evacuation. So something which is not related to the life process of the buildings, not what we're really interested in. And it made me look back a few years when we had at DRL, we started with responsive environments that you can, with simple automatons, reconstruct a series of spontaneous formations and orderings. For instance, here in a corridor where you have a kind of laminar flow, left-right symmetry breaking, or if you bring in a narrow point, you have a kind of before and after orderings. You can see here that some kind of patterns of behavior which you observe in the real world can be kind of simulated by automatons. We know that, and there are certain queuing patterns, and so we've worked with this for a while, but we're moving away from just these kind of dots and circles, these physical elements, into automatons, which have different modes of behavior. And we're bringing this in with various tools, with Massive, with AI plugin for Maya, with MyArmy for Maya, for instance, with MyArmy. Some of these tools are developed for the game industry, particularly. And just as warming up to how crowds are moving, how people interact relative to each other, independence in what the environment gives them. But I want to move further, not just kind of moving about and circulating, but we're talking about functional crowds, meaning all kinds of activities, in the different types of activities which actors are going through in their lives, maybe within a day. Of course, there's also different social type, as I was arguing. There's different types of participants in a university. There's the students of different faculties, there's staff, there's visitors, there's teaching staff. So you can also embed different audiences within the model, reacting differentially to different scenarios and settings. And we're starting to simulate how you can order an event by giving a structured environment and giving rules of behavior relative to the features of the environment. With these two ingredients, you can generate emergent order through these local rules and embedding this order both in the distribution of features and in the second factor is obviously the scripting of the agent profile. I know at DRL we're kind of starting to play with this and operate with this and looking at, in essence, the different activity clusters in a plaza, for instance, and we've been doing that a number of years ago, actually, at DRL here already, that the way we have architectural elements somehow helping to structure certain social possibilities. And here again, the actors are kind of quasi-physical object, but later on there is more nuanced reaction, not only to touching, but things at a distance can draw people or repel people or guide people, ceiling features, color differences, anything. I think I had that. So we're working with attractors, with just trying out to get a handle on these tools, different behaviors. And there are degrees of randomness. I mean, in there, it doesn't have to be 100% deterministic. You can see here the event is kind of gathering around these objects. And here is simply the differentiation of the ground surface ordering different behaviors. So in the red zones, you're moving along, you're moving between. If you come close to the cluster, you kind of freeze and rest in these points. This could equally be the ceiling. This could be just different textures, carpet versus granite, whatever. And here again, the space is just stride with respect to expected speeds. And this is conceived as a semantic relation, as a semiotic relation, rather than a physical force. And I think that with the kind of sophistication and complexity of arranging multiple audience in complex scenarios, we can't do it by physical force. We need to do it through kind of semiotic system, the ordering of these events, so that relevant communication partners find each other in relevant, compatible, cooperative, interactive scenarios. can also use topography, obviously, to kind of structure and order the distribution and likelihood of having gatherings and I think this one for me was a kind of key moment where you can see that the environment can also kind of adapt and shift, but the point here is that there's a number of behaviors which the actor is capable of, and they are triggered by the environmental feature he or she encounters. So with this setup, you can construct a complex environment, maybe with its own dynamic features, script a series of different audiences, and then kind of work on this, work it through and work on it iteratively until you generate this kind of cooperative, complex order where the environment does in fact generate an overall ordering result. And this might be not only, it might also be kind of interactive to some extent, that participants might leave traces in a kind of stigmergy fashion to increase the likelihood of certain desired interaction events. And so we're refolding into this project also to some extent a kind of responsive environment, but more important for us is that a differentiated environment triggering different behavioral responses, but also there could be a kind of dynamic looping back of environmental transformations which choreograph a kind of dynamic unfolding and evolving event scenario where as the furniture transforms, the event transforms, and it goes through different stages of an evening, for instance, or day, but also where one could imagine that the environment is kind of responsive to some of the actors involved. And we've been thinking about the elaboration of social diagrams through interactive furniture, again, a few years ago at DRL, but at that time we didn't have the capacity to actually script agents, and we were just kind of keyframing in some of the behaviors. And now we can kind of fully operationalize these kind of interactions, study them, elaborate them, perfect them, and also what we didn't have at that stage, this consciousness of the semiological project being operationalized in this way. And these are just early stages and attempts of students at DRL currently. To study this, and here, for instance, the kind of flattened out piece of wall is an invitation to sit down, or has a kind of sitting potential. And but sitting is not necessarily one and the same thing, so we can also now go into the nuances of these behaviors. So different kinds of sitting, communicating different attitudes, for different kind of events triggered by different kind of furniture. The difference between a kind of soft, low sofa and a kind of hard kind of chair. So we're wanting to start to study and work through nuances of formal and morphological differentiations correlated with nuances of behavioral differentiations. And just final image that even kind of walking down the street is a kind of communication. You communicate attitude, you communicate certain readiness to interact or not. So even on that level, we can find in different settings, different environments, different atmospheres, different demeanors, different ways of gathering, passing each other by, even walking, sitting, etc. So that's the project, and I thank you for your attention. Are there any questions or contributions? Yeah.
Hey, Patrick. 847 slides, that's, I think, a record. I always admire your energy, how you can teach at 3 schools, run a major office, give lectures all over the world, and write books longer than Rem Koolhaas is, I think, astonishing. But I'm very nervous about some of the things you're saying about semiotics. And I've got two points. One is that traditionally, in theoretical circles, there's a huge opposition between the semiotic and the phenomenological. I mean, people like Henri Lefebvre stress that architecture is about textures, not about text. People like Bachelard criticize the obsession with reading and talk about the other senses. Also, you can see in the work of Deleuze, for example, an opposition between what he calls the Gothic, the understanding of structure, of process, of performance, and what he calls the Romanesque, or pretty much the classical, which is about representation, about appearance, and so on and so on. Now, you presented a kind of schizophrenic lecture. On the one hand, the first part, which there's very few words, but it was much was about structure, about kind of Friotto-inspired structural performance. And then there was this kind of the whole kind of second phase, or third phase rather, which is really about sort of like semiotics and so on. So it seems to me like, I mean, I think architecture is a much more kind of contested territory, maybe, and it's kind of challenging in some way. But my question is, like, in a sense, you start off with the work of the office and then your own theory. The question is, what does Zaha make of the theory? Does she buy into all this stuff?
Well, I mean, okay. Well, the question was multiple questions, all right? So the thing is that, as you saw in some of the projects I've been hinting at, that there is always already some level of semiotic encoding, which is intuitive, semi-intuitive, and partial, nearly in all projects. And to that extent, that this is quite commonsensical. Like I was describing the Vienna Library project and the Montpellier Library Archive project, for instance, the way the project is legible through its consistency of form-function correlations, and to the extent that they are consistent, they become a kind of semiotic code. And that the consistent reuse of certain correlations in an otherwise complex and differentiated whole. And to that extent, I mean, it's commonsensically, it's bought in, and Zaha is on board because we're teaching together the semiological project in Vienna, etc. But of course, it's something which for me also late in the game kind of comes together in this way. And what is new, for instance, the way the agent modeling is brought in, and but also the way the phenomenological interest is brought in as a precondition of the semiological project. I agree that there is those on the side of phenomenological interest have not been pushing that into a layer of the semiological project, but at the same time I do feel, for instance, in the work of Norberg-Schulz, that you have both the awareness and the interest in phenomenology and Gestalt psychology, and kind of an interest in a kind of semiological and semantic dimension of architecture. It's not worked through with this degree of systematicity, but I don't find, I find it convincing and compelling that one can integrate the different strands and the different emphases of progress, let's say, that were made in the late 20th and early 21st century. For instance, and to recuperate them into one coherent progressive project. The work on organization and organizational pattern and the intelligence built up in this domain through people like Christopher Alexander, Lionel Marchant, Philip Stedman, Bill Hillier, that whole strand, which were also the first strand in this domain of progress and research, was also the first time that we saw a computational tools being kind of brought to bear. To combine that with this kind of phenomenological strand, there has been an interest in this ever since Gestalt psychology emerged in the early 20th century, through people like George Kapesh, Gideon, Norberg, Schulz, etc. So there's a kind of strand of interest. Also, you find it in Christopher Alexander to some extent, as well as in Colin Rowe with this notion of phenomenal transparency. So there are strands, and for me it's very important with the theory of architectural autopoiesis that I think it's original, it's comprehensive, it's ambitious, but it's possible only through gathering these insights and moments and positing the notion that they need to be brought together into a comprehensive overall project. And the same is with advances in semiology and semiotics, which I think were fragmentary and came to be aborted, which you found in the late 60s, early 70s with Jenks, George Baird, Eisenman, Schumi, etc.
Question over here. Is this on? Yeah, there it is. So I guess what I wanted to ask was about the way you present your project. I mean, I think it's really interesting to see your whole process, your thought process, the historical process, the progression that leads you to all this. But just as first comment, I think it gets really dangerous when you start saying things like logically it follows, or intuitively you see that these are sort of embedded in something, where you say that things are just logical progressions, or you're making these leaps. And I think it gets really, really, really dangerous when you say things like that. You're trying to convince people that your way is better, your way is good because it's logical, because it's just rational. And although it's very interesting to see that you work that way, it's not, I think, the right way to do it, the better way to do it. The other comment I had was on the sort of particle things that you were doing at the end. I think when you use these sort of human-looking figures, the more human they looked, when they had their tuxedos, when they had their dresses, I think the less actual substance there actually was there. I don't know, maybe I'm reading it completely wrong, but it seemed to me that those were just particle simulations where the person was just a stand-in for a particle that behaves in a certain way. And the problem with that is that people are not particles. We don't behave in ways that can be defined by set equations. I mean, the one that I sort of understood was the one where you had people represented by these stacked prisms. They were just dimensions, and they were actually affecting the landscape by the way that they moved. But everything else was just sort of, here's some parameters, attractor points, and here are some particles, and this is what happens when you run the simulation.
Well, I mean, the fact that you can simulate human crowd behavior when it comes to circulation, queuing, evacuation panics even, that is kind of well established, right? So because the rules which govern the local rules, individual agent rules which govern the overall outcome are quite known. Of course, there's continuous progress there, where you have simpler models, and there's a debate about, how much foresight and how much recognition the individual has when he's acting and adapting his behavior. For instance, there are density-dependent behaviors. So these behaviors are continuously the rules of behavior are changing relative to particular thresholds of condition as well, and so on. So this is good, but it certainly can be done. And in these models, you can reduce to some extent the human agent to a kind of quasi-physics process, right? Now, but there is development of research and intelligence beyond that, which coming out of the game industry, which I've been looking at. And there's some research papers and interesting work being done, because for these kind of game environments, you want to create not just the autonomy which just rush out, but there are multiple behaviors and actions and interactions. And even degrees of freedom and inverted comma spontaneity. So there is research where the kind of life process you simulate become richer. I don't know the particular details of their programming, but the concept is quite clear and important. And I think that's where I want to go. I want to go to the attempt to simulate things like seminars, workshops, informal gatherings, and there is research also like this where you put cameras in public spaces, and you're trying to kind of tease out the rules, and they are kind of stochastic rules to some extent, of under which conditions and through which kind of physical features certain types of gatherings or little communicative events become more likely or less likely, and you can simulate that. And I'm going the step further, where I'm saying I'm not in the game of just simulating what is likely to occur with the kind of expectations and habits of contemporary city dwellers, but I'm inviting us to give more structure to the environment and more, therefore, an upgraded also behavioral dispositions, and you become creative with that. You become, in these projects, you kind of create the signification relation. You construct them in the model. Of course, the question then becomes how likely and probable is that this will actually be instantiated and happen. But for me, that's the second question. For me, the first question is, can I construct a model which allows me to have a kind of nuanced and intricate social life process modeled, where the key stratum of making this ordering happening is the built environment with its kind of nuances and features which these actors are responding to. Of course, I then have to reflect, could they actually notice it? And the model, I can script any kind of response to hidden magnetism and features. And I have to reflect, is it realistic that the person actually notices and sees the object which becomes the kind of attractor for him? Or does he notice the change in surface which slows him down and makes him more likely to kind of stop and look around? So you have to reflect on the phenomenology of perception. It's not only the visual perception, but also tactile perception. What resistance and friction does a particular surface give you? Do you observe differences in a distance? And there could be action by distance. But it's ultimately at the moment, in this stage, it's the very, very infancy of a project. It's something which just explores that potential and possibility. Of course, I'm fully aware that in the end, the true meaning and real life meaning of all these spaces and features will emerge in the actual occupation and participation process and cannot be controlled by the architect or determined by the architect. It's just an offering and a speculation whether such an offering could be internally coherently done. The only exception is perhaps, as I said, a kind of corporation which wants to kind of has maybe a large corporation with hundreds of people of different status groups, categories, with
Patrick, let me just interrupt.
Yeah.
I'm afraid it goes on.
Okay.
I think you just said something which undid everything you said. Everything. You said it's just an offering. And on the other hand, you spent a very long time trying to show us, I think, how a science would lead to a kind of objectivity of decision-making in architecture. If only we knew. By the way, you also throw in a discussion of, parenthetically, of freedom. Mm-hmm. So the definition of freedom is circumscribed by contouring the landscape and focusing the participants on certain kinds of destinations in order either to create a certain environment or to fulfill the aspirations of people in motion as you define them. So this is either wonderful because the versatility that you advocate is a kind of surrogate for freedom. Because in a way, the fact that people are moving around that fair or whatever it was, it's actually not so complicated. You know, a couple of food stands and a little bit of sun. I mean, you speed up the film, it looks like actually not doing a lot of things. If it were an airport, and you have somebody is running through Terminal 3 to get to the train to Terminal 2, if it were a jail, if it were a hospital, assuming that nomenclature still has some applicability, sure. Because you're suggesting it really doesn't anymore, and somehow nuance is now moving into more conventional definitions of space and use. But it would be very useful to show in the work, in other words, you got section 1 and section 3, let's say. You got a lot of sections, but 1 and 3. If you integrated 1 and 3, and you said, okay, this is a museum in Beijing, okay? And then you illustrated the movement of people in a particular kind of way. Even if it's an offering, you can't confirm it, you didn't ratify it, but never mind, it's illustrative. But if you see a museum in, for instance, Beijing, and you see a construction in Azerbaijan, and then you see, and what you tend to see are structural interests or thematic tendencies that seem to transcend cultures, and then your answer is, but it's global. So you don't really have to deal with either the question of individual freedom or the question of cultural differentiation. I think it would be useful for people who are watching that the buildings would confirm not necessarily that it's so, but that it has a chance to be so, as opposed to doing it in sections. I think as a way to make a case. One other thing, it struck me, you know this guy Christopher Hitchens? Mm-hmm. You know, a sort of American radical, whatever he is. And one of the points that he makes that has a certain amount of appeal is that somebody who is actually radical is always ready to countenance the possibility that the truth is something different than what he's arguing for. So just out of curiosity, are you prepared to countenance the possibility that the answer isn't quite different? This is Christopher Hitchens asking.
Yeah, no, well, this is very abstract. No, I've come to believe
that
the
people that are walking around.
No, I'm pretty sure that I could win the argument that First of all, that the core competency of architecture and designers, in distinction to engineers, is about communicative structures framing ongoing communications. And that why this has to become, why these kind of tools, I think, tools become more relevant and important, is that the institutions we design for are become more complex, more rich, with multiple audience, where the events have parameters, small, medium, large, extra large, dynamisms. And I'm thinking of examples like,
you make so many assumptions.
You can no longer,
one thing, because you make so many assumptions.
Yeah.
Complex wouldn't necessarily mean rich. I mean, if you talk about language, are we talking about Lil Wayne? We're talking about Jay-Z? We're talking about Bob Dylan? We're talking about William Shakespeare? You talked about Wittgenstein, who spent his life trying to understand the meaning of exchange. So never mind Finnegan's Wake or something like that. So there are so many linguistic possibilities, and we're just talking about English. Never mind the exchange between, I mean, with this guy, I remember years ago, we had a big argument about whether an American or an English-speaking person was entitled to talk about Nietzsche. You couldn't do it. Couldn't do it, was his position. You couldn't do it because the transmutation, it's not really a translation of language. Yeah, well.
But let me finish that point. I mean, I think what is important. Think about what happens in corporate culture, and if you do a kind of a large, complex, dynamic organization, they're now moving away, for instance, from having fixed, dedicated work desks for people, and moving to so-called depersonalized, differentiated bureau landschafts where people are free to roam, gather in different activities, book spaces perhaps temporarily, or just kind of appropriate a differentiated landscape. And they're very dynamic organizations. It's impossible for them to have a strict allocation of departments and tasks and domains of competency inscribed as labels into cells.
This is not news. This is not news. This is a modernist argument, actually. Neutral space. Here we go. We got a
it's something different. How do you design for this? How do you convince a client that what you deliver to them has the capacity to deliver that kind of complex, dynamic interaction scenarios of the kinds they would like to see, would like to have? And then you take the various social types, you take their staffs in different categories, you take visitors, you take consultants, you take a general public, and let them roam and move into these environments, but with particular rules. Rules of behavior I need to be able to presume, and then allow the environment, together with these rules, order and structure, efficient events. And we're working at the moment at DRL, for instance, also not an art gallery, but an art gallery, the way a kind of an exhibition opening unfolds with cocktail, with viewing, with small talk, the host saying a few words, different situations. So it's a kind of evolving event scenario with different constellations, different situations, or even a private party. If you have an ambitious social life and you entertain kind of in a sophisticated, rich environment, you need a complex environment with a lot of potentialities, a lot of situations.
What you're really doing is ratifying. But look, what you're really doing is, in the most quintessential way, ratifying in the most literal, precise means you can, whatever it is a particular constituency wants to do. For instance, you could argue that's what they want to do in an art gallery, but there might be a different hypothesis, an entirely different hypothesis, which is outside the frame of reference of people who do that or entertain in a sophisticated way. And the way you analyze it doesn't admit the possibility that the direction or the intention or the capacity to do something could be other than what it is. Because if you ask them and they tell you, go do this, or if for you, the fact that a corporate client is prepared to move around in a more flexible way or in a more open way, and you say, great, that means freedom.
But it means also for me productivity. So for us, I think the task is this: in contemporary network society, we can't kind of withdraw into our kind of little office cell and beaver away without continuously knowing what everybody else is doing. So we need intensity of communication, permanent recalibration, what we are doing with relative to what everybody else is doing. So we need every day a lot of interesting, rich experiences, encounters, exchanges of information. We participate. We need to continue to scan a complex environment. And how can you kind of demonstrate that your environment with certain assumed audiences is not wasting everybody's time because nobody finds anybody else. They're running down empty corridors into, they're wasting time not meeting anybody new, not having the chance to deepen a conversation with anybody. When they go to these places which are not facilitating this kind of elegant finding each other, gathering, but not getting stuck with somebody, but scanning at the same time who else to communicate.
Of course,
So
nobody
these
would disagree
intricate.
with that. It just depends. Are you talking
How do you
about a monastery?
No,
Talking about a jail?
I'm talking about
Talking about a hospital?
I'm talking about contemporary
You're talking
life.
about a
Google
sort of-
Campus.
a sort of
How do you design competently, confidently for Google Campus, and how do you convince Google that you have something to offer? And I'm saying with these kind of scenario building, these kind of tools and new models, I think they will become a kind of new state-of-the-art standard. You work like this or you lose. You're blunt. You just show some number of boxes with labels in them. And
But we're talking hypothetically. We're not saying that if you take this to Google and Google finds it plausible, that ratifies the fact that you took the right thing to Google. If they like it, and if it shows that you're progressive, that means they like it and you're progressive. Okay, so this is what they call Spengler would call a tautology. You're making your own case.
No, but the point here is that I think we need to look at, as an avant-garde of the discipline, how can the discipline now contribute to the most advanced arenas?
No question.
And that's the way we pose the problems. And I think they would be looking at a kind of continuously differentiated, complex, but richly ordered campus.
Google is in business. They're in business to do a number of things.
But I think Apple, for instance, made a huge mistake with that kind of.
We would probably agree on that. But
it kills communication. I mean, that kind of.
But the people
circle.
you're talking to at Google, depending on who you're talking to, have certain motivations. The people who are working there may have different motivations. So the model that you're using is likely to be a reflection of the people whose interests you claim the entire project represents. It may not. I mean, if you build a plaza next to Tiananmen Square and you build it for Hu Jintao, or you build it for Deng Xiaoping, or you build it for Li Jinping, or whoever it is, it might be very different than if you built it for the guys who made the Statue of Liberty out of styrofoam. It might be very different.
Well, I'm telling you, I want to work for Google in such organizations and maybe certain film festivals, or I mean, let's say contemporary high performance, high productivity communication arenas, which this world society needs more than anything else to progress. And I want to gear up to deliver for that.
You understand what I just said about Tiananmen Square?
Well,
you know
I'm
what
not
happened?
designing for
You
that.
know what happened there?
I know, but I mean, that's not the problem I'm posing for myself.
I know, but it's an issue. It's a cultural issue. It's a political issue. And for all those who say it just gets better, okay, maybe some things get better, some things get worse, and some things stay the same. And it might be useful to make a distinction about which is which. Thank you very much.
Shall we stop it here, or is there anybody else?
Just don't want to hold everybody forever. We got another day or two.
Okay, great.
Anyway, terrific. Thank you very much.
Thanks.